Thanks, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. It's good for you to turn in and watch this show. I have a lot of information I'd like to get across to you, so let's get started. I'm a wildlife ecologist, as Jonathan said. That means I study wildlife and their habitats, and I'm also primarily a conservation biologist. Conservation biologists are focused rather than on the basic or applied aspects of ecology. They're more dealing with how to help humans and species coexist in this world, how to maintain the functioning of ecosystems. And conservation biologists are involved all over the world trying to preserve rare and endangered species and helping ecosystems continue to function and supply the things that we need in everyday life. There are many stages of conservation biology. Everybody likes the exploration stage. Everybody likes going out and finding new species and discovering new places. It's the best part of this job, going to places that where you see things that very few people have seen. But most of the time, we spend our energy and our efforts in the science and the understanding. Once we discover a species or come to a new ecosystem, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how that species functions, what that species needs, how the species within the ecosystem interact, and how are we going to continue those interactions into the future. So I work at the science end of things. I'll have to admit that most of the problems in conservation biology come not at the science level. It's very interesting, and we have a lot of problems we have to think about on how to design a study and how to actually look at a species, but most of the problems come in at policy and management. Now, once we understand what a species needs, how can we meet those needs? How can we structure society so that it can coexist with these animals? How do you manage deer or manage giant pandas? That's where most of the problems come in, and that's where a lot of attention comes to in conservation biology. So what kind of animals do get our attention? Maybe you can give us some suggestions. Here are some right here on what I've thought of as why some animals are well known within this world and why people spend their time on those animals.
And Bill, we've put the question you've just asked over on the left side of the screen. What kind of plants and animals get our attention? Feel free to go ahead and type that in the box on the left side of the screen. We're hearing from Cesar that tropical plants are captivating people's attention. Catherine says pandas. And you can
Catherine's from Washington, D.C., so the National Zoo is always advertising its pandas.
This is true. And you can name specific animals, or you can tell us how you would categorize them, what kinds of plants and animals. We're seeing polar bears, Siberian tigers, deer. That's appropriate for today, perhaps. Skunks, foxes. Megafauna.
A lot of suggestions.
You bet.
You can see the general categories that animals fall into. These are either economic issues, that the animals have economic importance. A lot of animals are charismatic, like the panda. They can have a major ecological role in that once they've left that ecosystem, the ecosystem stops to function, like corals in the ocean. Many species are in danger of extinction, and also some species actually have cause us problems with overwhelming an ecosystem rather than disappearing from the ecosystem. So I look at deer. That's what I focus in on. And of all the endangered species or all the conservation issues in the world, a good question would be why deer? Why concentrate on deer? We have a question here because we're asking you, I think most people aren't aware of how many deer species there are in the world. Can you take a guess at how many deer species you think there are? I'm looking at this bar chart here.
And
most of you are doing, we're saying 75, 50. Those are pretty good guesses. Because there are about 50 deer species in the world. Here in the U.S., we know we all talk about white-tailed deer or mule deer or maybe elk, but there are many species that are spread all over the world. Here's a list of the 50 deer species, and I know a lot of this is too small for some of you to see, but it just gives you an idea of the breadth of species that can be found in one part of the world or another. Trying to get my little pointer to work here. But there are, on the left-hand side, most of these species are from South America, and there's a whole bunch of small species called brocket deer that make up a large portion of the species in South America. Whereas in Asia, you have muntjacs, or a large group of small deer that make up a area of concern in Asia. But there's also a lot of large deer sprinkled in here. A lot of people know about the moose or elk, white-tailed deer in North America, as we mentioned before. Barasingha is a large deer in India. So the deer species come in many different sizes. Here are some examples of deer, just to give you the breadth of the deer that are available are present in the world. Elk deer from Southeast Asia, caribou from Alaska, water deer, which actually don't have antlers. They have tusks as opposed to antlers. Very unusual deer. Here's some additional species. It's hard to get the sense of the size. Deer range in size from being about the size of a small dog to moose, which are some of the largest land mammals that we have. So deer come in a lot of different sizes. So if I were to group the deer together, there are 50 species. About 2/3 of those are in the tropics. That's where most deer live, down in the warmer climates, in the better vegetation areas. As a conservation biologist, I am mostly concerned about species that are in trouble. And the IUCN publishes a red list that sort of ranks these species on 4 levels of concern. And I have the 4 levels listed right there. If I was to make some generalizations about species, I would say that the most endangered deer come into 2 groups. They're either large tropical deer that live in grasslands, or a lot of those small Mazama brocket deer in South America. They're also endangered. But some deer are very abundant. Not every deer species is endangered. The most abundant deer are usually those large temperate deer that live in forests, like white-tailed deer that we have here in North America. No one would consider them endangered. They're more likely to be called abundant. Just to show you that list of deer from before, and now I've highlighted the species that are actually of some level of concern according to the IUCN. So all these species are species that we have to worry about. We have to worry about them being able to persist in the face of all these people that are now on the earth. And you can see these species, both South America, Asia, North America, the species are widespread that we're concerned about. Whereas there are some species we're concerned about, there are other species that we're worried about because there's actually a lot of them. These are species that are sometimes labeled as too much, and for that we have about 5 or 6 species. There are examples of moose populations that are very high in North America, white-tailed deer in North America, red deer in Europe, sika deer in Asia, Japan, fallow deer in Europe. These are species that are also of concern to conservationists, but not because they're about to go extinct, but rather because they're starting to dominate their ecosystems that they're in. If you were to take a course in deer conservation, there are 4 things you have to know about deer conservation. The 4 most important things for deer: habitat, 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 and protection. That habitat that's my way of saying that habitat is very important. If you don't have the right habitat, a species cannot exist there. And keeping track of the habitat, measuring the habitat, protecting the habitat is a lot of the effort that I and fellow conservation biologists are under. The second thing we have to look at is protection. What is the protection status of species? How are they in? Is there effective patrolling? Is there poaching regulations? How well can these species be protected? Because if nothing else, deer are endangered because they are edible, and a lot of people are using deer as a daily food. These rules of needing habitat and needing protection work on the both extremes of conservation, both for the cases where species become very rare and cases where species become very abundant. Habitat and protection are the two elements that we're always looking at. When it comes to habitat, deer respond to plants. Plants are what you measure when you're trying to measure how suitable is this habitat for deer. In the case of forest deer, most forest deer are living on the edge of the forest because that's where the plants come down to their level. It's no good having leaves 60 feet up in the forest. You need those leaves down at the level where the deer eat. And that happens in the forest, in the edge of the forest, where the field and the forest meet. So early successional forests, young forests, forests that have been broken up into pieces where there's a lot of edge, those are places where you find a lot of deer. The other place where you find a lot of deer is where there are extrinsic sources of productivity. Since deer eat vegetation, when vegetation is being added to the environment, that usually creates more deer. Usually there's a feedback loop where deer eat the vegetation becomes less, and you get less deer. They're able to reproduce less, they survive less, and they become in balance, so to speak, with their environment. In the cases of living around humans, though, humans don't pay any attention to the density of deer when they have their activities. So, for example, planting corn. A farmer will plant corn every year, regardless of how many deer are in the environment. So there is no feedback loop between the amount of corn being planted and the amount of deer in the environment. So you end up around agricultural sites the potential to get a lot of deer. The same with some crops, some trees that produce seeds. In the United States, North America, the most obvious example are oak trees that produce acorns. Acorns are dropping out of the tops of the trees. The deer eat those acorns. They're a very important food source for them, but there's very little feedback between the acorn production and the eating of the deer below. The trees keep producing acorns year after year regardless of the density of deer below them. So again, you have the potential for, in these habitats, ending up with a lot of deer because of these extrinsic inputs of energy. When it comes to predation, it's a little more straightforward. Predators eat deer. The way deer eat vegetation, predators eat deer. And deer are a major source of food for a lot of the predators that we're also worried about as conservation biologists. A predator of another type is a human. We are as much a predator on deer as any of the tigers or the lions or the wolves. In the case of humans, it's a matter of can we control that amount of predation? Is there poaching regulations? Are there patrolling activities that can regulate the human predation or not? If there aren't controls on that human predation, then you usually end up with too few deer. That's the examples from South America and from Asia where the deer are becoming endangered, usually because the poaching levels are too high. Whereas if you go to the developed world where there's very good controls on poaching, the parks are well patrolled, the parks are well staffed, what you also have in those circumstances a lot of times is the predators are missing. So in North America, you don't have wolves anymore in the eastern United States. You don't have mountain lions in the eastern United States. Those used to be two major predators on deer. So we have better control in the human poachers, and we've lost our natural predators. That combination of things results in too many deer. I'll give you an example from the state that I live in. I live in Virginia, and Virginia is a case study for how the deer populations have been going. If you went back to 1938, in 1938 there were about 40,000 deer in the state of Virginia, and they only occupied these green areas of the state. Most of the state had no deer. In fact, we established a big national park here called the Shenandoah National Park, and the state officials went to Arkansas and captured deer in Arkansas and brought them back to Virginia because we had so few deer in this state that there were none inside that national park. By the 1980s, we had deer in much larger portions of the state, but we also started to get these red areas. Red areas are, for the state, it's where the local community considers there to be too many deer, where the conditions are such that deer are causing a lot of problems, and the people are saying, protect us from the deer rather than protect the deer. So deer issues in the United States, in Virginia at least, really didn't exist before 1980. That's when we first started getting the sense that there may be too many deer under certain circumstances. Whereas by the time you get to the end of the 1980s, you have a lot of red areas in the state. There's a lot of areas in the western part of the state and around some of the urban areas where people are saying, whoa, there's a lot more deer than there used to be, and they're causing a lot more problems than they used to cause. So by the time you get to the end of the 1990s, a lot of the state is that way, and deer are pretty much spread throughout most of the state. If you look at the numbers from 1930s, we were at 40,000 deer. By 1998, they estimated there were 1.2 million deer in the state of Virginia. Right now, over 200,000 deer are being harvested each year by hunters. And that is not enough harvest pressure to regulate this number of deer. The deer numbers are still increasing. So this is a conservation success story. This is what conservation biologists usually want to happen. We want to go from something being relatively rare to being abundant. But in the case of deer, in Virginia, people are starting to say, hey, enough is enough. How can we get these things more in line with our management priorities? So when do you worry about deer? When do you call something overabundant? When do you say this is too much of a good thing? The answer to that is not really a biological question. It includes both society's desires as well as biological features. For example, an animal can be considered overabundant when it causes significant economic loss to a community. So if you're living around elephants in Asia and those elephants are destroying your corn crops every year, those elephants may be an endangered species as far as Americans are concerned, but if you're living in that community where the elephants are destroying your crops, then you would consider them overabundant. You would probably be advocating for the government to control those elephants in order for you and the elephants to coexist. You would also say animals are overabundant if they lower the diversity of other species across the landscape, or if they cause unsustainable demographics of rare species, especially plant species. It's difficult for them to reproduce in cases where there's a lot of deer. So all their flowers and all their seeds are being eaten, and the demographics of that plant population has been changed to the point that it can no longer coexist with those deer. Lastly, that having so many animals alters the pathways for productivity and succession in that ecosystem in a way that the ecosystem doesn't function as efficiently as it did before. So those are four major themes that would cause managers to label something as overabundant. I guess this would be a good time here to ask, are there any species around where you live that might be considered overabundant? I'm talking about white-tailed deer, but we have people online from all over the world, and there might be species in your area that also are a problem for that community.
We are seeing a few responses here. Miss B has said that they have over 600 mule deer that live in their town in Craig, Colorado. In some people's eyes, they've become a hazard in the town. We're also hearing from Amy that they've got a lot of deer and rabbits. And Becca in Mount Vernon is talking about an overabundance of squirrels as well.
Huh.
And one person actually said people, which is interesting.
No, I would not necessarily disagree. A lot of these problems the problems are conflict between people and animals, and we focus on the animal side of it, but there are a lot more people than there used to be before, and it's hard. The conflict is, there are guilty parties on both sides as far as this conflict goes.
We're hearing from Christine in Milwaukee, by the way, that they have, I'm sorry, Christine's comment just vanished on me. There it is. That in Milwaukee and its suburbs, they've had to eradicate deer because they were eating people's gardens as well.
Yeah. And eating a garden is not really an ecological thing. It's not a biological reason for regulating deer. It's more an economic condition. Here's an example of economics for white-tailed deer in the United States. This is the deer vehicle collision data for the U.S. from the 2009-2010 year, that there were 1.1 million accidents reported between deer and vehicles, and these caused $3.8 billion in automobile damage. And they caused 140 people to lose their lives. So that is a serious concern. Even if you just look at my state of Virginia, that's 52,000 collisions, and we're only talking about ones that are reported to the insurance companies. We're not talking about deer that get hit by vehicles and then run into the woods and the vehicle just keeps going. It's a case where there's enough damage to report these things. So it is a significant economic issue for the United States. I don't usually deal with the economic side of things. I deal with the ecological side of things. Can we measure deer impacts on the ecosystem, and can we place a value on those impacts to the point where we say deer numbers should be either increased or decreased under a certain circumstances? So I'm either looking at direct interactions where deer consume plants or consume resources that other animals want, or I'm looking at indirect impacts where deer alter the habitat, and by altering the habitat, they help some animals and hurt others. If we're talking about white-tailed deer, as I said before, their numbers have increased tremendously. If we go across the United States, this is a very rough estimate, but the rough estimate was that before Europeans arrived in the United States or North America, there were about 3 to 4 deer per square kilometer. And now we have densities of greater than 35 deer per square kilometer in most of our protected areas. So we have a tenfold increase in the density of deer. And each one of these deer is consuming about 5 to 9 pounds of acorns and fruit, foliage, vegetation every day. Now, that's what deer are supposed to do. They're supposed to eat vegetation. That's how they get through life. We have to see in our regulating and our managing protected areas whether this is a sustainable amount of consumption or we have to regulate those deer numbers. To give you some examples from our studies, here's looking at wildflowers, in our case, trillium, which is this red flower right here, and other species like showy orchis. We looked at the amount of flowering that these plants were doing at sites with low deer densities and sites with high deer densities. And this is percent flowering on the side here, and trillium is the blue one. And you can see under low deer densities, about 65% of the plants are flowering, whereas under high deer densities, it's about 1 or 2% of the plants are flowering. It's because when the plant starts to flower, the deer eats off that flower head, and the plant is not able to produce another flower that year. So this is an example of these unsustainable demographics that the plants cannot persist if less than 10% of them are flowering on any year. Whereas under low deer densities, you get anywhere from 15 to 65% of these plants flowering. We also have some examples we studied bird populations to look at how birds are impacted by the densities of deer. And we fenced out places to remove the deer. Those are the closed sites. And we left some sites open so the deer were able to come and go at those sites. And we looked at a number of bird species here. I'm just talking about American redstarts. But we put the fences up here in 1990, and we tracked the bird populations over time at those sites. And so these yellow bars are places where we fenced out the deer. And the number of birds for this species inside those fenced sites is about 3 times the number of the open sites. And we have about 9 or 10 species where we've demonstrated that by changing the density of deer, we can change the number of birds inside that site. And that's done primarily by changing the vegetation. Deer eat vegetation. When there's a lot of deer, there's very little vegetation, and birds need to eat the insects that are living on that vegetation. So when you remove the vegetation, you remove the insects, and because the insects are removed, there's no place for these birds to feed and sometimes nest. So that shows you the kind of interaction between deer and other species. If I went through a whole bunch of studies, I could say that there are studies showing deer impact bird species, they impact predation rates on artificial bird nests, they impact small mammal densities, they impact plant species, as I showed you, and also they actually increase the amount of invasive plant species. So whereas they decrease the abundance of some things, they actually increase the abundance of others, such as invasive plants. So the take-home message from if you went through all the literature and looked up these studies, you would say that deer density impacts the way the forest functions. And when you change that deer density, you change the structure and the function of that forest. The forest I work in is primarily Appalachian Mountains. I'm in the eastern United States. This is a large forest that goes from Maine down to Alabama. It's encompassed pretty much by this black line on this slide. And inside that black line, there are many protected forests. That's what all these green areas are. It's pretty much all forested, but the green areas are protected forests that have to be managed by the government, either state or federal government. This forest is old-growth forest. Now, it's more than 100 years old. It's deciduous forest, which means it's rich with a lot of species, and it's also close to urban areas, so it gets a lot of use by people. If you're going to work in the Appalachians and you're going to study the things that are important in the Appalachians, two things you want to study are oak trees and deer. And we reviewed some deer interactions, but let's talk a little bit about oak before we go on. Oaks are an important part of this forest, and primarily because there are several reasons, but one is that they're widely distributed. Oaks are a species of trees that are found throughout the eastern United States, and that they're often the most abundant species in the forest. This graph here, the darker the color means the higher the percentage of oaks in that forest. So you can see in Arkansas, which is out here, oaks are making up about 80 to 90% of the forest. Where I work here on the Appalachians, oaks are making up anywhere between 60 and 80% of the forest is composed of oak trees. In a lot of other communities, it's lower, but still oaks are widely abundant in at least 20-30% of a lot of our forests that are in the eastern United States. These oaks are important to wildlife ecologists, which is what I am, because of their acorns. Those acorns are being eaten by more than 60 species of mammals and birds. And there's a long list of things that you can find that eat acorns and rely on acorns. One reason they eat acorns is because these seeds are a 3-season food source. And the oak trees themselves are a foundation species. And I want to go over a couple of these things in more detail. For a foundation species is a species of plant or animal that forms the structure of that ecosystem. So they may be abundant, they usually are abundant, and their occurrence in that ecosystem sets to a large degree the other species that are able to occupy that ecosystem. And we're talking about tree species. There are several tree species that create whole communities around them. Eastern hemlock, bald cypress, Fraser fir, mangroves, oaks that we're discussing now. A very famous foundation species was the American chestnut. The American chestnut was a very abundant species that was found in the eastern United States, but has now been removed from our forests due to introduced blight. But these species all are important for the ecosystems in which they occur. I don't know if you have any examples where you are of species that appear to structure the whole ecosystem around you. An example outside of trees would be coral reefs, like I mentioned before. Coral reefs structure that underwater environment. pine trees. That's a good example. A lot of pine forests are structured by those trees. Acacias are a very important tree in Africa and in Asia. Maples and Douglas fir. There's a lot of good examples here. Scrub oak is an important species in the West, in Texas, in Colorado. Those species of plants set up the insects and the birds and the mammals that can also live in that environment. Those are all good examples that everyone's having. I wanted to point out the nutrition of acorns, why acorns are so important to wildlife, and I've just set up a comparison here. I have two different kinds of acorns, red oak acorns and white oak acorns, and I'm comparing them to the nutrition that you find in leaves. And the most important value here is crude fat, percent crude fat. Fat is energy, and the more fat you can have in a food source, the more energy is packed into that food. And you can see that acorns have a much higher energy content than leaves. So you can eat a little bit of an acorn and you can get a lot more energy for a lot longer amount of time than you can from getting a leaf, eating a leaf. I should also mention that, as I said before, they're a 3-season food source. What that means is that you can take an acorn, bury it in the ground in September, dig it up in March, and it's as good a piece of food, as full of as much energy as the day you put it in the ground in September. Whereas take a leaf or a blueberry or a blackberry or an apple, dig a hole, put it in that hole, and within a week or two, that piece of food has now spoiled and is not good to eat anymore. Acorns are one of these hard nuts, are some of the few foods that you can store for very long lengths of time, and that makes them very important for a lot of the mammals that have to undergo winter, have to survive winter, because acorns are something they can store in their nest or store underground and eat all winter long. They're full of energy and they store well. The problem with acorns is that they are variable from one year to the next. You cannot predict, or it's very difficult to predict, how many acorns are going to be any one year. This is an example over about a 20-year basis of a number of sites that we looked at, and the height of this bar tells you the amount of acorns they had at that site, and the different colors are from different sites. And you can see you have a stretch when there are very few acorns, and then you have a stretch of years when there are intermediate amounts of acorns, and then you have some years where there's many acorns. And even in a year like that, some sites are having a lot of acorns, and some sites are having very little acorns. So whereas we can say animals are very dependent on acorns, animals are always looking to find and store acorns, they cannot predict from one year to the next how many acorns are going to be out there. That makes it very difficult for that ecosystem to be stable over time, and that the mammal community, at least, is fluctuating up and down with this acorn production. I see I have a question that would be good to ask here would be, can you there's no right or wrong answer to this, but can you think about why would oak trees produce so many acorns one year and not another? Why don't? What would evolutionarily cause oaks not to produce the same number of acorns year in, year out? Why is that kind of variability found in oaks? Rainfall is an answer that someone's giving. Differences in soil, wind conditions. There's a lot of different ideas. Most of these ideas have to do with weather conditions, that as the weather conditions change, the amount of acorns change. And to a certain degree, that's true. The seeds are set in the spring and they drop in the fall for a lot of the oak trees. So if you have a very windy or wet spring when they are setting seeds, then you get few acorns that next year. But look at it this way. Oak trees are not producing acorns to feed all the squirrels and chipmunks in the world. Oak trees are producing acorns in order to make small oak trees. These are their babies, and they're trying to throw their babies out there in a way that they can grow into be oaks. So they do not want these acorns to be eaten. And if the world was full of squirrels and chipmunks all eating every acorn they produced, they would have no reproduction and there'd be no next generation of oaks. So by having the amount of acorns go up one year and down the next, when the number of acorns go down, the number of seed predators that can survive the winter becomes very low. So if you have few chipmunks and squirrels that survive the winter, then the next year you produce a lot of acorns. There aren't nearly as many predators to eat your acorns as there were the year before. So this kind of variability, this kind of boom or bust system that the oak trees produce, we think is a way to eliminate a lot of the predators that are trying to live off of these babies that they're producing. There is a lot of data looking at how the mammal populations boom or bust in response to the acorns. Whether you're looking at white-footed mice or chipmunks or bears or deer or turkey, their numbers seem to go up or down with the production of acorns from one year to the next. Just to show you how complex the world is, here's an example from some studies that are being done outside of New York City on looking at the interaction between deer, mice, oak trees, and the ticks, which communicate Lyme's disease. And if you know the acorn production if you know the mass production in 1 year, you can predict the amount of Lyme's disease that'll happen the year after that. Because the amount under good acorn conditions, the deer and the mice, their numbers increase. They move into the oak stands. They pick up the ticks. The ticks do well. The ticks produce more offspring, and that results in more disease the next year. Whereas under poor acorn years, the animals do not move around as much. There's a low survival rate. There's less animals for the ticks to live on. Therefore, there's less ticks. They pick up less disease, and there's less of that disease communicated to people. So the acorn production is tied to the amount of Lyme's disease that you find in people through this complex movement through both white-footed mice and white-tailed deer. That's just an example of one of the examples of how intricately tied in deer, oak trees, and the mammals in these forests are to each other. I'm worried about oak trees, and a lot of conservation biologists are worried about oak trees because they're declining. There aren't nearly as many oak trees as there used to be 50 or 60 years ago. And that's primarily not in the older trees. The older trees are still there, but what we're starting to miss are these intermediate-sized oaks. When you go into a forest and you look at the trees in that forest, you can see the age structure. The bigger trees are older, the intermediate-sized are the middle-aged or the teenage trees, and then you have all the baby trees down below. So trees have to move through that progression. Trees don't run into an area or run over the side of the mountain to the other side. Trees have to grow up at a site. So if you want to see what your forest is going to look like in 100 years, you want to look at the small and the medium-sized trees in that forest today. And one thing that's happening in forests in the eastern United States is that we have very few small and medium-sized oak trees. Whereas we have a lot of adults, we have a lot of old-age trees. Most of these small and medium-sized trees are maples. So our forest, if we're going to look 100 years into the future, our forests are transitioning in a lot of places into maple forests as opposed to oak forests. And maples do not have nearly the seed crop with as much energy as oak trees. So that will have ramifications for our wildlife species that are dependent on those acorns. So there's a lot of researchers looking at what can we do to increase the survival of oak seedlings or oak saplings. How can we make more baby and juvenile oak trees? And there are two issues that are out there. One I've discussed already, white-tailed deer, and the other one that other researchers are looking at are invasive plant species. that invasive plants can also reduce the survival of seedlings by covering up the light that gets down to the forest floor. By growing over the top of other plants, they can kill out those plants and prevent their succession. Here in Virginia, we have a lot of invasive plants, plants that have come from Asia or Europe or Africa and get a hold here in Virginia and come to dominate some of the ecosystems that they're in. Honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle, Japanese stiltgrass, Russian olive, those are some common names for species that are relatively common in our forest now. So we're looking at plant survival. In this case, I have a trillium here, but for the sake of this discussion, we can think of this as an oak seedling. And this oak seedling is impacted right now by two things: white-tailed deer, which are eating the plant directly, and invasive plant species that are competing with that seedling for light and nutrients. And both those things are hurting the survival of these plant species. I can get rid of the invasive species. I can go and pull it up, or I can put on herbicide to try to remove that invasive plant species from the forest. But how does that impact the deer? How does the deer browsing get in? How does the deer respond to the removal of that invasive species? If the deer has to eat, and the deer has to eat 9 pounds of vegetation every day, if you remove some of the vegetation, do you just cause increased eating on the species that you actually want to preserve in that species, in that area? So it's a dilemma. It's a management dilemma. Can we reduce the number of invasive plants without increasing herbivory on the plants that we actually want? And if we reduce herbivory, the deer actually eat most invasives. Very few invasives are poisonous. So the deer are eating these invasives in addition to the native plants. And if we get rid of the deer, maybe we increase the amount of invasive plants and they just cover up more native plants than we did before. So is it possible to do one thing or the other, or do we really need to do both things at the same time in order to get this system to function? So we set up an experiment, and we had a bunch of sites where we went in and measured the vegetation in these sites. We had 79 sites where we did nothing. Those are our control sites. We had 53 sites where we removed all the invasive species twice a year. We had 45 sites where we fenced out the deer. And we had 49 sites where we did both. We both pulled the invasives twice a year, and we prevented any deer from getting into those sites. And we want to see how the plants, both the woody and herbaceous plants, respond to that kind of activity. And I'm looking at your responses here. Most of you are voting that both things are necessary, and that, well, let's see what the data looks like. This is an example of what one of our plots look like. This is a plot where we have fenced out the deer with that plastic fencing, and we've pulled all the invasives. In this case, the invasive is microstesium, or Japanese stiltgrass, and you can see how it covers the forest floor in this part of the forest. And we've pulled it all out and left just the native plants behind. That those few green things you see inside the fence are native plants that were living underneath that microstesium that was there. So this is a pulled and fenced site. And I only have time to show you a little bit of the data. Here's data from oak seedlings. So this is the youngest oak trees. How many oak seedlings, what's the number of stems you can get in different plots? And this is the number of stems you get in control plots where you did nothing, the number of stems you get in pulled plots where you pull out the invasives. So pulling out the invasives did not increase the number of oak seedlings. If anything, it decreased the number of oak seedlings. And then this is the sites where we fenced out the deer, and here are the sites where we both pulled the invasives and fenced the deer. So the response is primarily due to the deer, getting rid of the deer, but there is some additional response by doing both fencing and pulling the invasives.
We have a quick question here, Bill, from Katie, who wants to know, are there invasive species that are not harmful to oak seedlings?
Sure. There are two types. There are alien species. Alien species are species of plants that, or in this case plants, that are brought from other continents and released in the area, and they exist. They never get that abundant. You see them in the forest or you see them in the field, but they don't become dominant in any one ecosystem. There are maybe in the United States about 4,000 alien plants that have been identified. Of those 4,000, about 400 of those become invasive to the point that their numbers start to dominate an ecosystem. And of those 400, probably less than 20 occur in oak ecosystems. So there's probably less than 20 invasive plants that we are really worried about with regard to oak species. Whereas the invasives in general are not a good idea. There are a lot of alien species, but not all of them are invasive. It's these 20 that are causing us problems with oak seedling regeneration. That's a good question. I just wanted to point out that if you're doing forestry activity, before you cut the trees, you want a certain number of seedlings present in order to regenerate that forest. And this is the number of seedlings you need to have present before you do forestry operations. And you can see you don't get that under controlled circumstances or when you just pull the invasive. It takes the removal of deer to make enough seedlings. I can show you the same data from saplings. This is a little out of kilter here, but saplings are these bigger juveniles. They're trees that are taller than a meter tall, but not taller than 2 meters. And this is the density of saplings. So it takes these trees about 5 or 6 years to get to be this size, whereas seedlings show up that year. So after 5 or 6 years, who's surviving? Under control conditions or under pulled conditions, we have very few saplings, whereas under fence conditions, we have about 0.12 saplings on average per plot, and under pulling and fencing, that's where you get the most seedlings. So you can get about 3 times as many seedlings per plot when you pull and fence as opposed to just fencing. So that's more indication that you need to do both of these things, both controlling the invasives and regulating the deer, if you want to make these young oak forests that we're so worried about. So I don't have a lot of time left here. I want to try to wrap up the last of these slides. I'm a wildlife ecologist, and if I study wildlife in the Appalachian Mountains, I'm worried about seeds. These hard seed crops, acorns in particular, are important for a lot of the mammals and the birds that we have in these forests. And in order to make those seeds, I need to have mature oak trees. And in order to have mature oak trees, in the future, I need to see baby oak trees right now. And the only way I can see to get that at this point in time is to create low densities of deer, to control the invasive plants, and to allow light down onto that forest floor. We didn't have time to talk about that today, but that's a critical component. So I need to do those 3 things if I want to manage this forest to make the kind of trees I need to keep my wildlife. So we've done a whirlwind tour here. We've talked about a lot of things. This is a summary slide just to show you that deer are part of a complex ecosystem, that oaks may be the foundation of this ecosystem, but deer have a very important role. They have a lot to do with the number of seedlings and the amount of ticks and the rodents and the understory seedlings and migratory birds. All those things interact with deer to some extent. And we're trying to understand this new player in the system, these invasive plants and pathogens, how they interact with deer and how they interact with the whole system. This is what we're trying to understand. What happens, though, under some circumstances, is that deer become very abundant. They increase in numbers so that they overwhelm some of these interactions, and they come to dominate a system where before they were one of the multiple players in the system. And those circumstances may, under what we're finding right now, we may need to regulate those deer in order to bring them closer to their historical function in that system. But I want to say that having too many deer is not it's just as bad to have no deer. Deer are not an invasive species. They're not an exotic species. They should not be removed from this forest. A forest without deer functions just as poorly as a forest with too many deer. And as a conservation biologist, I worry about both ends of it. I worry about the too many and the too few. That's what being a conservation biologist is, trying to reach a point where animals and people can coexist, and that involves dealing with both of the extremes. As I said before, I deal mostly at science, but you can see how a lot of these issues have to do with policy and management. What are you going to do with so many deer? How are you going to regulate those deer? How can you convince people that there's a reason for regulating those deer? That all comes in with issues that need to be played out in the community-by-community basis. Every community has to make a decision, are deer a problem in my community, and what am I going to do about it? But I would mention that this involves management. It involves working in the forest. It involves trying to understand the forest so that you can manage it wisely. And that's about it. That's all I have to do today. We've gone through a lot of slides and a lot of topics in a very short time, but hopefully you'll have the opportunity in the future to go back and look at a little more detail at some of the issues that I brought up today and be able to explore some of these things a little more deeply that we've just been able to touch on quickly here today.
Bill, thank you so much. And you said the keyword explore further, and I'd like to turn now, before we let you go and let all of our colleagues go, to Mandeep to talk a little bit about some next steps and some things we can all do to pursue our exploration and even action when it comes to these issues. Mandeep. Do we have Mandeep with us? Or if Mandeep's not with us, maybe we can turn to Josh Falk to say a few words.
Yeah, hi. I'm not exactly sure what happened to Mandeep, but